afternoon. Welcome to the inaugural lecture at the Nexus. Ben Goldfarb, our speaker today, is the first visitor to the University of Montana in this series, hosted by the UN Bridges, a National Science Foundation funded initiative, and several other offices around campus. The lecture at the Nexus series will feature experts on topics related to the nexus of water, energy, and food systems. This particular lecture, focused on science communication, is co-sponsored by UM School of Journalism and Office of the Provost, with additional support from the National Wildlife Federation. This is not your ordinary guest lecture. Ben Goldfarb has spent the day sharing his expertise as an environmental journalist with the UN community. He has met with graduate students and professors in disciplines such as systems ecology, natural resource journalism, economics, resource conservation, and environmental studies. At noon, I and many other people had the pleasure of attending a conversation Ben facilitated on water availability in a changing climate, with three of the university's accomplished professors in the fields of human dimensions of natural resources, fluvial geomorphology, and bioclimatology. My name is John Harbour. I'm the provost here. I've just started my 4th month as provost, and I am very impressed with the focus on water here at the University of Montana. The university is a leader in the conversation around many aspects of water as an essential component of myriad ecosystems, as cultural resources to honor and protect, and as a resource to share, monitor, and regulate. With the lecture at the Nexus series, UN Bridges is making a great stride in keeping the university at the forefront of this critical conversation. Although I'm excited by many of the amazing things that go on at this university, this Nexus is of personal interest to me, as I was actually a co-author on a Water-Energy-Food Nexus paper last year as part of an interdisciplinary team I work with in Qinghai province in Western China. I'm Roy Young, Professor of Society and Conversation at UN Bridges co-PI, to tell us more about the UN Bridges program, their focus on the Nexus, and to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Provost Harbour. So I'm Lori Young. I'm the Program Director for UN Bridges, and UN Bridges trains graduate students at the Food Energy Water Nexus here at UM. It's a national research traineeship program sponsored by the National Science Foundation. And we're co-sponsoring these lectures at the Nexus with the Provost's office and other groups on campus and off campus. And it's my pleasure to introduce our inaugural lecture at the Nexus speaker, Ben Goldfarb. Ben describes himself as an environmental journalist and a Beaver believer. And I think you will really know why after this talk. Ben has published in Orion Magazine, in the Washington Post, in High Country News, in Science, in Scientific American, among many other outlets. He also has written fiction. He's coordinated the award-winning Small Towns Big Change project. And he's also given lectures at Stanford, Yale, and now the University of Montana, which I'm sure will go up on his bio right next to those other universities. Ben has a master's degree in environmental management from Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And he says he's happiest with a scuba tank strapped to his back or a fly fishing rod in his hand. So we are pretty lucky to get him into this classroom today for this talk. And he's going to be focusing on his recently published book and work that he's been doing for a while now. His book is actually titled Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter. And I think this crowd tonight really attests to the really compelling nature of sort of current cutting-edge thinking on beavers, whether we're thinking about them in the context of ecosystem restoration or improving agricultural productivity or climate adaptation. And so I'm really excited to see all of you here tonight. And with that, I will hand it over to Ben.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Lori and John, and thank you all so much for being here. This room is an incredible testament, I think, to the ascendancy of beavers in the zeitgeist. This is like the most people who have ever attempted to talk about a rodent. So I'm incredibly excited to be here, and UM is a place that I've always admired. Of course, the journalism program, the wildlife biology program, now the Bridges program. There are so many fantastic educational resources here, and it's a wonderful institution, and I'm truly honored to be talking with you guys today. And I'm especially honored to be talking at the nexus of food, water, and energy. It's hard to think of three more important topics, and three topics that are so interrelated. And my goal in the course of this conversation today is to basically convince you that at the heart of these three topics lies a very special animal. And I know that's kind of a grandiose claim, that three things as vast and important as food, water, and energy could all pertain to this furry creature, and yet, to my mind, it's really the case. So the notion that beavers are at the center of food, water, and energy systems is not remotely a new idea. One of the mysteries that always puzzled historians, or long puzzled historians, was the question of why, when the fur trade moved to the West, native people did not participate, right? So when the first European colonists arrive in New England in the 1600s, they find indigenous people very willing traders, right? They're giving them, pots and knives and other materials, and in exchange, native people are trapping pelts and supplying beavers to French, Swiss, or Swedish rather, British and other traders, and Dutch, of course. But by the time the fur trade reaches the western United States, all of a sudden, native people are no longer willing to supply pelts to white fur traders, which is why people like Kit Carson and Jedediah Smith and Jim Bridger and Hugh Glass and all the folks you read about in The Revenant end up having to trap beavers themselves, because native people don't do their dirty work for them. And for a long time, that kind of puzzled historians, but it turns out, as Rosalind Lapierre, who's a Blackfeet historian and is here at UM, has written and demonstrated so persuasively, the reason for that is that the Blackfeet and other tribes revered the beaver because they understood the beaver's centrality in providing water to arid western landscapes. Right, beavers create ponds and wetlands, which is water. Those ponds and wetlands attract bison and other game, that's food, and beavers are even cutting the firewood, that's so important, so that's energy. So as Rosalind has written quite brilliantly, I think, the Blackfeet learned through observation that beavers helped create an ecological oasis within a dry and arid landscape. The Blackfeet sanctified the beaver because they understood the natural science and ecology of beaver behavior. So in a way, beavers are very hot in the restoration world right now, but that's simply because the restoration world has finally caught up to knowledge that existed for thousands of years. So how did that knowledge get lost? How did we sort of forget about the centrality of beavers to our systems? That was sort of the animating question when I set out to write this book. And for me, as a person who spends a lot of time standing around in streams, casting flies at trout that usually don't bite, I had a kind of a certain view of what a stream should look like. And a lot of what this book's about is sort of deconstructing our historical picture of what a healthy aquatic ecosystem looks like, how it functions, what sorts of creatures inhabit it. And I just wanted to read to you quickly a few paragraphs from the introduction to Eager that sort of get at the way our landscapes have changed with the eradication of beaver and what bringing beavers back will do for the American West. This is a quick excerpt from the first chapter of Eager. Close your eyes. Picture, if you will, a healthy stream. What comes to mind? Perhaps you've conjured a crystalline, fast-moving creek, bounding merrily over rocks, its course narrow and shallow enough that you could leap or wade across the channel. If, like me, you are a fly fisherman, you might add a cheerful, knee-deep angler, casting for trout in a limpid riffle. It's a lovely picture, fit for an Orvis catalog. It's also wrong. Let's try again. This time, I want you to perform a more difficult imaginative feat. Instead of envisioning a present-day stream, I want you to reach into the past, before the mountain men, before the pilgrims, before Hudson and Champlain and the other horsemen of the fur apocalypse, all the way back to the 1500s. I want you to imagine that the streams that existed before global capitalism purged a continent of its dam-building, water-storing, wetland-creating engineers. I want you to imagine a landscape with its full complement of beavers. What do you see this time? And you can open your eyes if you haven't already. I should have included that in the book to begin with, but anyway. What do you see this time? No longer is our stream a pellucid, narrow, racing trickle. Instead, it's a sluggish, murky swamp, backed up several acres by a messy chain of woody dams. Gnawed stumps ring the marsh like punji sticks. Dead and dying trees stand aslant in the chest-deep pond. When you step into the water, you feel not rocks underfoot, but sludge. The musty stink of decomposition wafts into your nostrils. If there's a fisherman here, he's thrashing angrily in the willows, his fly caught in a tree. Although this beavery tableau isn't going to appear in any field and stream spreads, it's in many cases a more historically accurate picture, and in crucial ways, a much healthier one. In the Intermountain West, wetlands, though they make up just 2% of total land area, support 80% of biodiversity. You may not hear the tinkle of running water in our swamp, but listen closely for the songs of warblers and flycatchers perched in creekside willows. Frogs croak along the pond's marshy aprons. Otters chase trout through the submerged branches of downed trees. The deep water and the close vegetation make the fishing tough, but abundant trout shelter in the meandering side channels and cold depths. In A River Runs Through It, Norman Maclean captured the trials and ecstasies of angling in beaver country when he wrote of one character. So off he went happily to wade and ooze and to get throttled by brush and to fall through loose piles of sticks called beaver dams and to end up with a wreath of seaweed round his neck and a basket full of fish. So I had to get that Blackfoot River shout out in there. I had to get a little Maclean. So anyway, that's sort of the driving theme of this book, is how do we learn to embrace this kind of beaver-influenced system, which is nobody's idea of a beautiful stream, or maybe most people's idea, or not most people's idea of a beautiful stream. How do we embrace this as natural and healthy and incredibly productive? So what's the creature that creates these kinds of systems? You know, in the restoration world, I think people tend to talk about beavers as a tool, right? They're out there building dams and creating ponds. And they don't give much thought to the beavers themselves, but beavers are actually evolutionary marvels. And I think it's worth taking a real quick moment to just talk about this incredible animal. So what's a beaver? What kind of animal is a beaver? Somebody just shouted out. It's a rodent, yeah. It's North America's largest rodent. What's the world's largest rodent? Yeah, of course. You guys are good. You guys know your wildlife. What does a beaver weigh? How big is an adult beaver? 50 pounds. Yeah, you guys got this. So beavers, of course, they're semi-aquatic rodents, right? So they spend most of their life in the water, and they have all kinds of incredible adaptations for this really unique semi-aquatic niche that they have. First of all, they have incredibly dense fur. So beavers actually have as many individual hairs on a postage stamp-sized patch of skin as we humans have on our entire head. So amazingly dense fur, which of course was ultimately their downfall. They've got these webbed, sort of duck-like hind feet that make them incredibly agile and powerful swimmers. How long can a beaver stay underwater? How long can a beaver hold its breath? 15 minutes, yeah, so pretty impressive. They have these amazing transparent goggle-like eyelids they can close over their eyes to protect their eyes underwater, these nictitating membranes. They also have a second set of lips. They have a set of fur-lined lips they can close behind their front teeth so they can chew and drag branches underwater. I think that's a really cool one that most people don't know. Of course, they've got this amazing sort of multi-use appendage, their tail. They're kind of their most famous defining feature. Who's heard a beaver tail slap? Is that a sound that's familiar to you guys? Yeah, of course, anybody who's canoed on a mountain lake at night has heard the classic beaver alarm call, the slap of a tail on water. It's also a fat storage device. So just as bears put on fat for the winter, beavers actually put on fat in their tails. And it's also a thermoregulatory system. They have a kind of a specialized set of blood vessels at the base of their tail that basically help regulate their body temperature. So the tail is really an incredible organ. And then, of course, finally, they have the famous beaver teeth, right? And the teeth, why are they orange? Because they're actually chemically fortified with iron that beavers derive from the food they eat, which, of course, is essential because they spend a lot of time gnawing down trees. Who here thinks that beavers eat fish? No, okay. You never know. You have to ask that question because every once in a while a hand goes up. But, of course, beavers are entirely herbivorous. They eat the cambium of trees, which is the inner bark, kind of the sugary layer that does the growing. What's a preferred beaver food tree? What do beavers eat? Aspen. What else? Cottonwood. What else? Willow. Yeah. Anything else? Alder is another kind of classic food species around here. But they really eat most deciduous trees. They kind of tend to avoid conifers. They also eat lots of herbaceous plants, cattails and water lilies and even poison ivy in some places. They're what scientists call choosy generalists. So they have the few species they like the most, but they'll eat just about anything green. So in addition, of course, to eating the cambium, the bark off of the food trees they cut down, they also use that material in construction. What would you call this beaver structure? A lodge, yeah, this is kind of the basic beaver housing unit, right? In a typical lodge, you've got 4 to as many as 10 beavers on the high end. That's the mating pair. They're monogamous. They mate for life, along with the newborn kits who are born in the spring, the 1-year-olds and the 2-year-olds. And during their second year, the 2-year-olds disperse out looking for their own territories, kind of like teenagers heading off for college. And inside the lodge, you've got basically a raised sort of nesting platform that the beavers line with the kind of wood chips that you would see at the bottom of your hamster's cage. So it's pretty cozy in there. So that's the lodge. And then what's the other basic type of beaver structure? That's the dam, yeah, of course. And why do beavers build dams? What is the point of this thing? Why go to all this trouble? Safety, yeah, exactly. So beavers, one biologist described a beaver to me as a slow, smelly package of meat. Right, when beavers are on land, they're easy prey for cougars, wolves, coyotes, bears. In water, of course, they're much safer. So the primary purpose of the dam is basically to expand the extent and depth of water. Right, they're just increasing the amount of habitat in which they're safe. They're also covering the entrances to their lodge so that predators can't get up in there. And they're also actually irrigating their own food supply, right? By spreading water out and raising groundwater levels, they're actually sort of cultivating water-tolerant species like willow that are so important to them. So in addition to creating their own habitat, of course, beavers are inadvertently creating habitat for all kinds of other creatures. I said in the introduction to the book that wetlands cover 2% of total land area in the West and support 80% of biodiversity. Water is life, right? This kind of system is incredibly valuable. Scientists refer to beavers as keystone species, right? Just as in architecture, the keystone is sort of the top block at the top of a stone arch, and if you remove the top block, the entire stone arch crumbles. Beavers sort of play a similar role, like wolves or salmon or elephants in an ecosystem. Right, so what kinds of creatures depend on beavers? Just make a list, name an animal. Waterfowl, of course, are very dependent on wetlands for forage and nesting sites. Obviously, amphibians, frogs and salamanders breed in beaver ponds. Fish, of course, just increasing the extent of water and sort of the complexity of habitats. That's really great for all kinds of species of fish, and we'll talk more about fish later. And then there are the ones that you wouldn't expect. So, for example, songbirds like flycatchers and warblers actually do really well in beaver-influenced habitats because they love that sort of shrubby willow that beavers help promote. That's really good nesting structure. Recently I visited a beaver complex in Vermont this summer, and there were hummingbirds everywhere because as beavers open the canopy up and more light strikes that wetland, you get all of this flower production, and the hummingbirds are attracted to the flowers, right? So I've never seen that, documented in a peer-reviewed paper, but anecdotally at least, the connections between beavers and life are vast. Obviously, they're by opening up the canopy, they're increasing primary production. So there's more phytoplankton being generated. That's good for the zooplankton and other, which in turn feeds the aquatic insects. It's really hard to name a species that does not at some point in its life cycle benefit in some way from these wet habitats that beavers are creating. So historically, of course, we know that there were far, far, far more of these wet habitats on the landscape. It's sort of hard to reconstruct what a pre-trapping North America would have looked like, but by reading trappers and explorers' journals, you can kind of get a vague sense. And here's the kind of thing that you read a lot. So this is from Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark fame. This is here in Montana in the Missouri Basin. The Corps of Discovery is heading up the Missouri, and Lewis is basically remarking on beaver presence every single day. So here's an entry from July where he writes that Captain Clark saw a number of beaver dams succeeding each other in close order and extending as far up those streams as he could discover them in their course towards the mountains. So that's beaver dams in every single tributary of the Missouri as far as the eye can see up to the mountains. And again, he's making notes like this every single day. And in many places, in fact, the Corps of Discovery couldn't even use these valley bottoms because they were so thoroughly dammed and ponded by beavers. They had to travel along the ridgelines because beavers had so influenced those lowlands. So that's in 1805. In 1843, just 38 years later, John James Audubon, the famous naturalist and painter, goes traveling up the Missouri River, the same exact route, looking for beavers to paint. He's trying to paint all of the mammals in North America. And he wants to find a beaver, and he's got a trapper along with him, helping him try to catch one. And he doesn't find a single beaver in the entire Missouri Basin, where, again, less than 4 decades ago, Lewis and Clark had seen beavers everywhere. So what happened in just 38 years? Where did all of those beavers go? What did they get turned into? What did they become? Hats, yeah, of course. So I think that a lot of people when they hear beaver hat, they tend to think of some kind of big furry Davy Crockett-like thing. But in fact, this is kind of the classic beaver hat, this sort of Victorian top hat that came in many different styles. And the reason that beavers were such good hat material is because they actually have 2 layers of fur. They have the coarse outer hairs, and then they have the under fur, the beaver wool. And those under hairs have little barbs on the end of each one of them, kind of like Velcro, so they lock together. And that creates this really durable, pliable, waterproof material. So beavers were, along with timber and cod, one of the most significant commodities in North America. And it's hard to overstate just how significant a role the beaver trade played in early American history. It's really incredible the extent to which practically every historical event before the Civil War has in some way a beaver connection. So for example, when the Pilgrims arrived, they owed lots of money to their creditors back in Europe. The only way they could pay off those debts was by shipping pelts back across the Atlantic. So beavers really made the Plymouth colony, the Massachusetts Bay colony possible. The American Revolution was fought in part because colonists got angry after the British denied them access to beaver trapping grounds west of the Appalachians. That was one of the British offenses that kind of pissed off the colonists. The Louisiana Purchase was partly inspired by Jefferson's desire to secure more trapping grounds. And of course, the beaver trade was also a catastrophe for native populations. Many of the smallpox epidemics that ravaged Western tribes were spread by beaver trappers and traders. So the story of beavers is sort of the story of early American history in all of its grandiosity and tragedy. Who's this guy? That's a good guess. It's not Steve Bannon, who it also resembles. It's not after this. This is Peter Skeen Ogden, and Ogden was in the employ of the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay Company dominated most of North America for a very long time. They were there for so long that their initials HBC were said to stand for Here Before Christ, and they were sort of this pretty nefarious agents. So what's interesting about the beaver trade here in the Northwest, and I'm sort of lumping in Western Montana with the Northwest because it was once part of the Oregon Territory, is that the beavers here were sort of part of this really interesting geopolitical struggle. And the details are basically that for a long time the Oregon Territory was basically jointly occupied by the British and the Americans. Neither side could really agree who owned it. They sort of fought over where the border should be placed. And in the 1820s, the British Hudson's Bay Company decided that as sort of a political strategic maneuver, they would kill all of the beavers in the Oregon Territory so that the American trappers and the farmers who would inevitably follow them wouldn't find the area desirable. So in 1824, the Hudson's Bay Company basically dispatched this guy, Peter Steen Ogden, to wipe out beavers all over the Oregon Territory, as far south as Utah. He came as far west as Montana, and all the way to California as well. So over the course of 6 years and a series of expeditions, Ogden basically wiped out beavers in every single stream, river, lake, and pond he came across. Here's a quote from his journal in 1829. He wrote that it is scarcely credible what a destruction of beaver by trapping it this season. Within the last few days, upward of 50 females have been taken, and on average, each with 4 young ready to litter. So elsewhere, the Hudson's Bay Company wouldn't have killed pregnant females. They were reasonable beaver stewards or conservationists, but again, because they're trying to wipe out all of the beavers in this very strategic way, he killed the pregnant females as well. So it was really quite this enormously consequential event with profound repercussions for American landscapes. What happens when you kill millions of beavers? Incidentally, who's got a decent sort of population estimate for how many beavers existed in North America before European arrival? How many beavers are we talking about here?
60 million.
60 million is sort of the bottom of the estimate. What's the top level of the population estimate? 400 million, yeah. So potentially several hundred million beavers existed in North America. How many beavers existed at the kind of the nadir of their population at the end of the fur trade? 100,000, yeah. You're within an order of magnitude. So that's, as you can see, that's 99.99 something percent, just an epic destruction. And I think that we don't really put the loss of those beavers in the same terms as we describe, let's say, the deforestation of New England or the busting of the Midwestern prairie or placer mining in California. We don't think about beaver trapping as kind of this seminal ecological catastrophe, but in many ways it absolutely was, right? You get this mass breakdown of beaver dams, the draining of ponds and wetlands, and the loss of millions and millions and millions of acres of watery habitat. Do you know what this animal is? It's a boreal toad. It's an amphibian species that in many places breeds almost exclusively in beaver ponds. So what did it mean for boreal toads or moose or wood ducks or cutthroat trout that we lost, again, countless millions of acres of beaver-created wet habitat? We'll never really know what the ramifications were, but there's no question that they were extreme. So fortunately, after several centuries of unabated trapping, we started to wise up. Here's a great quote from a book by Enos Mills. Mills was sort of a contemporary or a mentee of John Muir's. He wrote this great book called In Beaver World, and he wrote that a live beaver is more valuable to mankind than a dead one, which is a nice sentiment. And in the early 1900s, we began to reintroduce these animals to many of the places that they'd been eliminated. There were big beaver relocation programs in Oregon, Washington, Utah, California, and of course the most famous beaver relocation project of all took place in Idaho. Do you guys know about the Idaho beaver relocation? Does that ring any bells? Let's see, we've got some YouTube footage here that we're going to play. So the story in Idaho is this is in 1948. Beavers are sort of returning to the Idaho landscape, and they want to move more of them into the backcountry. They try relocating them on horseback, but the horses, understandably, don't really take to that. So they realize that because it's 1948, which is just sort of post-World War II, they've got all of these airplanes and parachutes on hand. And that leads to the project you're about to see here, wherein beavers are dumped into these special crates perforated with air holes, and as you'll see shortly, dropped from airplanes. This is definitely not how it's done anymore. This is not the state of the art in beaver relocation. So So that before they did this, they kind of tested this strategy out on a crash test beaver named Geronimo. They dropped Geronimo repeatedly onto this airfield, and eventually he actually got so accustomed to being dropped that he would just kind of scamper back into the cage and wait for the next drop. So this is what it looks like when you. This is wildlife management in 1948 here. So that year they moved 76 beavers by air. 75 of them survived. One unfortunately somehow got free in midair and fell to his death. But the next year when they flew back over these lands, they actually found evidence of dam building and lodge construction everywhere they had dropped beavers. So in some ways it was really an enormously successful program. But again, fortunately, we don't do this anymore. We do it with fish, though. So today, of course, there is even though we're not dropping from airplanes, there is still lots of beaver interest all over the West, and a lot of that interest, I think, is centered around these three categories that are at the heart of the Bridges program, which are food, water, and energy. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about how beavers relate to these three topics, how we might collaborate or work with beavers in ways that promote our food, water, and energy resources. So I'm going to sort of go through each of these at a time. So what about beavers and food? How do beavers pertain to food production? This is a stream called Maggie Creek. This is in northeast Nevada in Elko County. This is 1980. And as you can see, does this stream look good? No, clearly not. This is basically the result of 100 years of unmanaged grazing, right? So you get cattle in a stream bed, basically stripping all the vegetation. There's nothing holding the banks together. The banks kind of crumble, and you end up with this sort of very degraded, lifeless, eroded channel. So that's the stream in 1980. In the early 1990s, the Bureau of Land Management, in partnership with the ranchers who grazed this stream and other streams in the watershed, decided to do something about it. So if the problem was cattle in the creek, the prescription was very simple. It's get the cattle out of the creek, right? They fenced off some of these riparian areas. They just did different grazing rotations. They kind of moved the cattle through there more quickly. And thanks to those prescriptions, vegetation, especially willows, began to return to Maggie Creek and other nearby channels. As the vegetation came back, what came back to eat that willow? Beavers, of course, right? So here's what the stream looked like in 1980. The next slide I'm going to show you is what the stream looked like in 2016 when I visited. And that's going to be after 20 years or so of vegetation recovery leading to beaver returns. I just want you to keep this image in your mind and then have your mind blown by this, right? How cool is that? I think it's cool. And again, that's in large measure thanks to beavers. You can just see how lush and wet and green and blue it looks. And you may look at this and say, well, where are the beavers? I don't really see much evidence of beavers here. In fact, that middle row of cattails is growth atop a beaver dam. So beavers have just profoundly transformed this channel. And you can just look at it and very anecdotally see how healthy and lush and good it looks. But of course, because this research was done by scientists, they also quantified some of these changes. So what are the sorts of changes that we might associate with beaver recovery? Well, they gained 100 acres of riparian vegetation. So this formerly completely destitute, lifeless channel suddenly has plants growing on it, believe it or not. 20 more acres of open water. So of course, beavers are building dams. They're spreading water out. They're creating these ponds and marshes and wetlands. You got 3 more miles of wetted stream link. So I think that's a really cool one, right? Is that this stream was actually going dry before reaching its confluence with the Humboldt River. Right, by getting beavers back in there, you slow the water down so that there's still water in the stream in summer and fall. Right, they basically took this seasonal creek and turned it into a perennial stream by delaying the progress of the water. Right, so you often hear that beavers steal water. That's a complaint that I hear from landowners sometimes. Of course, they don't steal water; they just slow the water down, and that's incredibly beneficial. And then finally, you also see a 2-foot increase in the water table associated with beaver recovery. And I think that's a really cool one, right? Because when you look at a beaver pond, of course, there's all of the visible surface water that you see. But what you don't see is all of that water soaking into the ground, right? The weight of the pond is just pressing huge amounts of groundwater into the soil and recharging aquifers. And that's why you get that fantastic green growth on the floodplain, right, is that beavers are actually sub-irrigating this entire valley. And that's a big deal if you're this guy. So again, we're talking about beavers and food production, right? Well, this is a guy who produces food. His name is James Rogers. He's a ranch manager in Northeast Nevada. He's a big beaver believer. And the point that he made to me when I visited him is that, he's seeing in these beaver-influenced valleys 1,000 pounds of grass production per acre, which is 10 times as much as he's seeing in his sort of dry sagebrush uplands. So beavers are producing enormous amounts of food for him and basically taking stress off his cattle and helping his cows grow faster. So that's a really big deal, right? Beavers are enhancing food production. They're also helping to mitigate some of the worst effects of food production. What is this a picture of? What's going on here? It's runoff, yeah, exactly. This is basically the dead zone that forms in the Gulf of Mexico, along with many other water bodies around the world every summer, right? This is basically the result of enormous amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, and other chemicals being dumped on farms in the Missouri or the Mississippi watershed and running to the ocean and fertilizing these vast algae blooms that basically use up all of the oxygen and create this huge hypoxic zone. So you start to wonder, well, how do we start to capture some of this runoff? How do we capture those nitrates and phosphorus? Well, this animal that creates these settling ponds, essentially, might offer some help. This is a kind of a growing area of interest in research. Here's a study from Rhode Island done a couple of years ago that basically found that beaver ponds were potentially capable of capturing 45% of the nitrates in rural New England. So that's, again, that's not a huge area, but that's a huge amount of nitrate capture, right? So the idea of using beavers as basically settlement ponds or almost like kidneys to filter out water pollution and protect our estuaries and oceans from this dead zone formation is a really exciting and promising area of research, and there are a number of studies that document results similar to this one. So I think that's kind of cool, is that not only are beavers enhancing food production, again, they're also helping us mitigate some of the impacts of food production. How about beavers and water? Well, beavers and water is a vast topic, and I could talk about almost any aspect of this, but the part that I'm going to focus on is beavers as a sort of a tool for stream restoration. So who's ever seen a stream like this one? Does this look familiar to people? Right, so we've all seen this kind of catastrophically incised or eroded stream. And actually the reason this stream looks like this is because of the removal of beavers. In a healthy beaver-rich stream, right, all of those dams are basically acting as speed bumps. They're slowing water down, they're spreading it out, they're just checking water velocity. When you lose beavers, you lose those speed bumps. There's nothing slowing down water. And what you get in many cases is this kind of dramatic incision or sort of gullification, where clearly the stream is basically locked in its own basement, right? There's no way for the water to spill out onto the floodplain and recharge that groundwater. So in this case, beavers could be helpful in sort of reversing some of this damage. Here's kind of a complicated, well, not that complicated, but here's a diagram from one paper about this process. You don't need to worry about the specifics, but basically, you start it with this sort of incised channel, beavers build dams, and by the end, you've sort of got this lush, green, watery floodplain. So that's the sort of the hope, is that beavers can basically slow down the water, settle out sediment, rebuild those channels, spill water back onto the floodplain again, and create a nice, lush, wet meadow. The problem is that what beaver in her right mind is going to want to live here, right? This is not suitable beaver habitat. The dam is going to blow out right away. There's nothing to flood, really, because the stream can't access the floodplain. So no beaver wants to live in this kind of habitat. So in those cases, when you have systems that could use beavers but can't currently support them, what often makes sense is the creation of beaver dam analogs. So what's a beaver dam analog, or a BDA? Well, it's basically a human-built beaver dam, right? You can see in this picture, you've got some very smooth, straight posts that have been pounded with a hydraulic post pounder into the stream bed. People just kind of weave some branches through the posts and basically create kind of an artificial beaver dam, or a starter kit for beavers that might someday recolonize this stream. It's not a very sophisticated or high-tech process. Again, you can use a hydraulic post pounder or just a sledgehammer. The risk here is obviously broken fingers. This is sort of the one occupational hazard of the beaver dam analog constructor. But if you're willing to risk a broken hand, the benefits can really be immense. So where this technique, the beaver dam analog strategy, was sort of pioneered and developed is in a place called Bridge Creek, which is in central Oregon, which is the site of a threatened run of steelhead. Steelhead are rainbow trout that go to the ocean like salmon. And there, beginning in 2009, I believe, they built 115 of these beaver dam analogs. As a result, Beavers, which had been in the system but sort of struggling to construct dams, built 121 dams of their own. So they actually saw an 8-fold increase in beaver activity. They saw a doubling of the inundated areas, the amount of land area underwater as beavers build these ponds and marshes and wetlands. And they saw a 12-fold increase in side channels, right? So as all that water is spilling onto the floodplain, and you can kind of see that really well in this picture, right? As water spills onto the floodplain, it's accessing all of these historic side channels. And that's a really big deal for these guys. This is a juvenile steelhead. And of course, if you're a baby fish, you don't want to be living in the main channel. You're just going to get blown downstream. You want to find a nice slow side channel or a backwater or an eddy or a deep pool. You're looking for the kind of complex, multi-threaded habitat that beavers are so good at creating. So it's no wonder that resulting from this project, these scientists in Oregon found a 52% increase in the survival of these juvenile steelhead. And again, for a threatened fish, that's a really big deal. So the notion of beavers as sort of these salmon habitat enhancers is a really exciting idea. One complaint that you often hear from fish biologists that we were just talking about earlier today is the notion that beavers block fish migration. Who's ever heard that idea, that beavers are an impediment to fish passage? Right, exactly. We're trying to take dams out of streams, now put more dams in streams, right? You hear that a lot. But of course, beaver dams, we know, are not like concrete dams. They're quite permeable. Fish find their way over them, or around them, or through them. And in evidence of that, here's a picture that I took a few months ago. This is in Western Washington. You can see the top right. You can see a beaver dam, and upstream of the beaver dam, here are 2 coho salmon redds, or coho nests, excavated from the sediment. So clearly, fish have found their way over this particular barrier. So that's obviously very anecdotal, but again, scientists have also, in that same Bridge Creek study that I cited just a minute ago, researchers found individual steelhead passing more than 200 beaver dams and beaver dam analogs. So clearly, these kinds of very permeable beaver-built structures are not much of an impediment to fish. What kind of animal is that? Bull trout. Yeah, you guys are good. Of course, we're in western Montana. You guys know what a bull trout is. So another concern that you hear about beavers sometimes, especially around here, is that beavers warm up stream temperatures, right? They're exposing all of this sort of ponded surface area to the sun, and that's warming up stream temperatures, and that's bad for cold-loving fish like bull trout. And that, too, is an idea that is increasingly, I would say, being debunked. Here's kind of a complicated chart. This is like the only data in my talk. But this is also from Bridge Creek, and there they basically found that beaver dams are actually modulating stream temperatures. They're basically buffering against really hot stream temperatures. And the way they do that is, again, because they're basically forcing water into the ground, they're creating this nice sort of what they call a hyporeic exchange, right, where groundwater and surface water are mingling together. So beavers force water underground, the water cools off, it emerges downstream, and basically moderates stream temperature. So even if you get sort of local, hyper-local temperature increases at the site of the beaver pond, when you zoom out to a kind of a reach, the scale of a larger stream reach, you're actually seeing that beavers are sort of this mitigator of temperature increases, and therefore potentially helping these fish survive as our streams warm. Which sort of leads to the final component of all of this, which is the notion of the intersection of beavers and energy. So how do beavers and energy interact? Well, there's a lot of discussion right now about beavers as a climate adaptation tool. And I think this strategy is sort of reaching its apogee in the Methow Valley. So the Methow Valley is in central Washington, not far from where I live in Spokane. The Methow Valley is a big fruit production area. They have lots of apple orchards. And this is sort of what you get when you combine beavers and apples. Obviously, beavers and apples don't mix especially well. So the way that this sort of conflict was traditionally handled was by trapping out the offending beaver. But what the Methow Beaver Project, which is sort of this multi-agency nonprofit collaboration, began to do in around 2008 was live trap the beavers. So here's a beaver live trap. This is a Hancock trap. You set this by the water's edge. You bait it with some scent lure, and what you get is a beaver. Now we know that beavers are very family-oriented, right? We said that earlier. So ideally, of course, you're moving the entire beaver family together. But that's not always possible, right? I mean, sometimes you're going to catch beavers by themselves as those 2-year-old beavers disperse out. You know, they're looking for a mate, they're looking for a family. Those are often the beavers you catch. So what do you do when you catch a solo beaver that has no family? Well, ideally, what they do at this Methow Beaver Project is they basically pair the beavers up, right? They have sort of a beaver Tinder service. They're operating this beaver love motel at this fish hatchery, and they're creating compatible beaver pairs so they can relocate them together, right? Again, you move a beaver by itself, it's going to go wandering around looking for a mate until a cougar eats it. If you move beavers together, ideally, they'll start building right away. So this is Sandy and Chomper. This is a successfully coupled pair ready for relocation. There is one big challenge. Well, there are many challenges, but one sort of the primary challenge of beaver matchmaking is that, so in this picture, Chomper is the male, Sandy is the female. Can you tell which is which? No, right? So beavers are actually impossible to visually sex. And the reason for that is that male beavers have internal genitalia, which makes sense because, of course, if you're an animal that spends its life swimming around log jams, you don't want some little dangling thing that you're going to get snagged. That's not very hydrodynamic. So beavers, kind of keep it all tucked up, which again makes them impossible to visually sex. So how do you tell a male beaver from a female beaver if you can't look at them and know? Smell, yeah. That was you guys are awesome. So beavers, they have sort of poor eyesight, really good hearing, and amazing senses of smell. They actually have two different sets of scent organs they have, or scent glands. They have the castor sacs, which produce castoreum, which is sort of a whole other story. And then they have their anal glands, which produce sort of this yellowish secretion that they use to mark their territories and actually send quite detailed, elaborate messages to each other. Beavers are actually capable of telling related beavers from unrelated beavers just by smelling each other's secretions, which is pretty cool. So we can also tell male beavers and female beavers by smelling their anal secretions. So this is the beaver anal gland. These are my hands. This is like this bizarre hazing ritual you have to go to when you visit the Methow Valley. They make you sex a beaver. That's like a rite of passage for all visitors. And you sort of squeeze a dollop of this anal secretion onto a tissue. You smell it. If it smells like motor oil, it's a male. If it smells like cheese, it's a female. So now you guys, if the opportunity ever arises, now you guys know how to sex a beaver. So anyway, we were talking about climate change, and then we sort of got diverted onto this beaver sexing tangent. So why are we talking about this again? And this is sort of the final phase of the beaver relocation, where they're moving the beavers into their new home. So why are we talking about beaver relocation in the context of climate change? Well, of course, we all know that the West is getting hotter and drier. It's getting more fire prone. That's certainly true in the Methow Valley, which has been hit by two of the largest two fires in Washington's history in the last several years. Here's a picture that was taken by Joe Wheaton, who's a great beaver guy at Utah State. This is the Sharps Fire in Utah this summer, and you can see incredibly clearly that all of the uplands have been completely blackened, and the wet green climate refuge is the lowland that beavers have so spectacularly influenced in this picture. This is really an amazing picture to me. This is kind of a classic climate refugium, right? The idea here, again, is that as wildfires spread all over these slopes. Creatures need some place to retreat to and then eventually disperse outward from and recolonize the landscape from. And beavers, again, are creating these incredible wildfire refuges. And they're also actually spreading, they're slowing the spread of wildfire, right? There are places in the Methow Valley where you can see, the fires burn down to the stream edge. It's black on one side and it's green on the other side because the fire hit the beaver pond and basically stopped. So the notion of beavers as sort of this, again, this climate and wildfire adaptation tool is a really exciting one. We also know, of course, that we're losing our snowpack in the West, right? Precipitation is falling as rain rather than snow. It runs off right away, and we're losing that nice sort of prolonged time-release trickle. So our streams are going dry much, much earlier in the year. So given that, the notion of using these rodents to create thousands of little reservoirs in the high country is kind of an attractive one. And again, this is something that hasn't really been studied very, very closely yet, I would say, but it's certainly promising. This is a thesis by one of Joe's graduate students at Utah State. And what did he find? He basically found that no, beavers are not going to save us from climate change. We're losing much more snowpack than even these incredible rodents can recover, but they are capable of putting a significant dent in our water storage needs. When you think about them compared to, say, modernizing irrigation systems, which is a somewhat costly endeavor, well, from a cost effectiveness standpoint, beavers look pretty good, right? All you do is just not kill them, and they basically perform this function for us. And then finally, an even less understood beaver function is their role in carbon sequestration, right? So there's all of this, organic matter that basically is settling out in beaver ponds. It's this incredibly carbon-rich stuff. And just as we sequester carbon in forests by planting trees, might we sequester carbon in the soil by planting beavers? Again, this is something that we don't quite understand yet. We know that beaver ponds are capable of releasing large amounts of methane as organic matter breaks down and decomposes. So, what role are beavers playing in the global carbon cycle? We don't quite know yet, but we're working on it. So I guess the place that I wanted to almost close is, ardent a beaver believer though I am, I know these animals can be huge pains in the butt, right? I mean, who's ever had some kind of run-in with a beaver? Who's ever had beaver trouble? Is that okay? Nobody in this room, yeah. So this is a set of railroad tracks in Massachusetts that were refurbished 2 years ago at a cost of $1 million, and within 2 months they were underwater. Right? This is basically the sort of trouble that beavers are capable of creating when they clash with infrastructure. Beavers, of course, they love building in road culverts, right? This is a classic beaver conflict. If you're a beaver, the road bed is basically this incredible dam, and the culvert is the leak in the dam. And beavers hate leaks. So this is what you see. This is what you often see. They raise the water temperature, wash the road out. It's this huge, very expensive hassle to fix. Sometimes they're a little more creative in the problems they cause. This is a beaver that broke into a department store in Maryland and was apprehended browsing the plastic Christmas tree rack. And was sent off to a wildlife rehab center. So that's pretty unusual, but they can get into some other mischief as well. So the way those sorts of conflicts are generally handled, again, is by trapping, which makes a lot of intuitive sense, right? The beavers are causing a problem, get the beavers out of there. And we trap quite a lot of beavers. These are numbers from my home state in Washington. We kill about 1,500 quote-unquote nuisance beavers a year, which you can see is about 15 times as many as we relocate alive. I couldn't find similar numbers from Montana, but I'm sure they're also very high. And again, as much sense as beaver trapping seems to make, there are a couple of issues with it. First, of course, you are eliminating or destroying all of the pond and wetland habitat that the beavers are creating, so you're losing whatever benefits are associated with those beavers. But second, you're also putting up a vacancy sign for the next family of beavers, right? As long as the habitat is good, the beavers are going to return. You just end up in this sort of endless cycle of very expensive trapping and recolonization. So how might you handle those sorts of problems in a different way? Well, this is called a flow device. Sometimes you hear it called a beaver deceiver. And this is basically this pipe and fence system. The pipe essentially, so you pass the pipe through the road culvert or through the beaver dam, and the cage is there to basically prevent the beavers from jamming up the pipe, and essentially you're creating this giant leak in the dam, right? So it's sort of this tool of compromise, I would say, where you can say, okay, I like having the beavers here, I appreciate what they do, but I don't want to have to snorkel through my backyard, and I'll use one of these things to basically regulate the water level to a point that's amenable to both landowner and beaver. This is Mike Callahan. He's sort of the one of the gurus who does this. He lives in Massachusetts, but he consults on beaver coexistence issues all over the country. He's trained many people in the West. Mike has found that these sorts of culvert devices and pond leveling devices are effective about 85 to 95% of the time. Maybe not appropriate for every situation, but certainly I think there are lots of conflicts out there, lots of low-hanging fruit that we're currently dealing with via trapping that we could be dealing with these sorts of solutions. And Mike is sort of this beaver genius, I would say, and he's got this great quote, which is that this is, it's like the art of war. You have to know your enemy, but of course beavers are not the enemy. They are our friends and allies in restoration, as we've seen. So the big issue, or one of the big issues, I would say, with beaver-based restoration is that there's a lot of uncertainty involved, right? If you are a restoration consultant or an engineer and you want to create a wetland and you dig a wetland out using a backhoe or an excavator, you can be reasonably confident that wetland will still exist in 10 years. If you try to use beavers to create the wetland, they might create the most spectacular thing you've ever seen that is beyond your wildest dreams, or they might create a braided stream or a wet meadow, or they might get eaten on the first day and do nothing. That's sort of, to me, that's kind of the immense challenge of working with wildlife in a restoration context, is that you don't know what's going to happen. So I think that's a really important thing to be realistic about, is the challenge that's inherent in working with beavers. But in a way, I think that uncertainty is actually kind of a wonderful thing. Here in North America, we spend something like $15 billion every year restoring aquatic ecosystems. And of course, it's wonderful that we do that, but it's also, the challenge, I think, is that we don't often know exactly what we're restoring to, right? The sort of the annals of restoration are filled with stories about, well-intentioned engineers who put in a single thread meandering channel when what the topography actually wanted was a braided channel or a wetland. And beavers, they don't do what we want, but maybe they know better than we do. This is a quote from Kent Woodruff, who's sort of my own beaver mentor. He's the former director of the Metcalf Beaver Project, and he basically made the point to me that we're not smart enough to know what a fully functional ecosystem looks like, but beavers are. And by outsourcing our labor to this incredible rodent, we might actually accomplish more than we would if we did this work on our own. So I just wanted to read to you the last paragraph of Eager, which I think gets at this. So here's, and I'll just close by reading again. This is the final paragraph of the book. God, I'm starting with God here. God, the Old Testament claims, granted man dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Beavers, presumably included. Our grandiose sense of self-worth, our human supremacy, as Derek Jensen has put it, guides our every interaction with other species, from the livestock we raise for slaughter to the wild carnivores whose populations we fanatically control. To work with beavers is to recognize the limits of our own divinely bestowed dominion. To acknowledge that the best thing we can do for many landscapes is to turn their salvation over to a mammal whose ecological vision diverges wildly from our own. Homo sapiens' defining trait is our hubris. Ceding our authority to beavers is an act of profound humility. Let the rodent do the work, which is the mantra of most of the beaver believers I know. So with that, I'll say thank you guys so much, and happy to take any questions.
So we have time for just a couple questions, and then there's a reception outside, so I will pass this around for 1 to 3 questions here.
Maybe more of a comment rather than a question. Ben, thank you so much for your talk. I will certainly buy your book. I think it was fantastic. I'm very appreciative also that you talked about the futility of trapping beavers, and I just wanted you to know that we have an organization here in Montana, Footless Montana. We've been trying to end trapping on public lands for about 10 years, and we've been recognizing the importance of beavers for a very, very long time. So we have unlimited trapping in Montana, unlimited trapping of beavers in Montana. So I just wanted you to know that, and maybe you have an opinion about that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you know, I know that trapping in public lands in Montana has been a big question for a long time, and I know about the ballot initiative a couple of years ago, and yeah, you know, that's a tough one. I mean, I certainly have talked to many trappers in the course of this book, and I respect their ecological knowledge, and they know the animal incredibly well through a kind of a different means of knowledge. But I also completely agree that trapping, given what we know about the value of these animals, in many cases is nonsensical, I think. I mean, there are lots of instances that I document in the book of a federal agency like the Forest Service relocating beavers only to see those beavers trapped out because the state game agency has refused to close trapping in that area. So I think that certainly there are lots of cases where state and federal agencies are working toward cross purposes.
So because recreation and tourism are such a big economic force in the West, I'm curious as to what sort of conflicts there are in the rivers or
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think it's a huge conflict because I think that the rivers that we tend to raft and kayak are larger than the streams that beavers dam. So I don't think that's a major conflict. I think that the more common conflict is probably with beavers and angling. Even though beavers again create fantastic fish habitat, it's habitat that can be pretty hard to access. So you know, I feel like one of the most promising developments to me has been seeing angling organizations like Trout Unlimited getting really excited about beavers because historically trout anglers have often been opponents of beavers. So it's great to see angling groups embracing beavers today.
Is there another question? We have time for maybe one more. Okay.
Well, being this is Montana and it's ruled by travelers and cows and this, how do we go about recolonizing when we have the livestock industry that really doesn't, support beaver reintroduction. The game department doesn't support reintroduction, and then we have the tractor. So, what steps? What would you suggest? Where do we even begin to recolonize?
Yeah. So I don't live here obviously, so I don't want to speak for anybody. But my impression, talking to various people this week, especially people like Sarah Bates, who's with NWF, is that I'm not sure that I entirely agree with the premises of that statement. I think that there are landowners and ranchers who are beginning to embrace beavers. I think that the state agency is increasingly interested in beaver restoration. So I think that it's happening. I think that to me the key thing is just finding that patient zero, or that first adopter. In Nevada, the example I gave, there's this one guy, this guy named John Griggs, who is this very progressive rancher who was willing to give beavers a shot and reaped these spectacular benefits and basically convinced his neighbors to become wholehearted beaver believers as well. So now you have this great little cluster of progressive pro-beaver ranchers in a very red part of the country. So I think that just finding those open-minded early adopters who are willing to sort of proselytize to their friends and neighbors is really key. And I think that there are lots of groups who are working on that right now. And I actually think that Montana is probably behind many other Western states in its beaver ethic, but it seems like it's catching up.
All right, well, I want to say thanks to everyone for coming. Really appreciate you being here tonight, and I hope you'll join us for a quick reception. You'll have a chance to ask Ben some more questions. Maybe he'll sign a book for you. And I hope you'll all join me in saying thank you to Ben for coming.
Thank you guys.